On the night of September 18, 1982, at approximately 11:47 p.m., a black four-door sedan pulled into an Exxon station along Route 7 in Springfield, Virginia, and what appeared to be a routine late-night refueling would set in motion a counterintelligence investigation that would expose a Soviet spy network operating undetected in the shadow of the nation's capital. The station sat at a busy intersection where Route 7 merged with secondary roads feeding into the sprawling Northern Virginia suburbs, a location that served as a commuter artery linking Washington, D.C. to bedroom communities where thousands of government employees, military personnel, and defense contractors lived. It was a 24-hour operation, the kind of place that never closed, where fluorescent lights buzzed through the small hours, and the smell of gasoline mixed with burnt coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the burner since the evening shift change. Robert Haynes had been working the overnight shift at the station for just over 8 months, a position he'd taken after leaving active duty with the Army earlier that year. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and found the solitude of the night shift suited him better than the chaos of the daytime operations, when the station was crowded with commuters rushing to fill their tanks before joining the morning traffic into D.C. His responsibilities were straightforward: pump gas for customers who pulled up to the full-service islands, handle payments at the register inside the small office attached to the service bays, keep the coffee fresh, restock cigarettes and oil when supplies ran low, and occasionally help motorists with minor car trouble, a flat tire or an overheated engine. The work was simple, repetitive, and for the most part uneventful, which was exactly what Robert wanted after 4 years in military intelligence where events were rarely simple and never truly uneventful. The station's typical late-night clientele consisted of long-haul truckers heading south toward Richmond or north toward Baltimore, shift workers from the manufacturing plants scattered throughout the industrial parks along Route 1, and the occasional lost traveler who'd taken a wrong turn off Interstate 66 and needed directions back to the highway. Robert had learned to recognize the regulars, the drivers who stopped every Friday night at the same time, the nurses finishing their shifts at the hospital 3 miles east, the security guards from the office complexes who bought coffee and cigarettes during their patrol rounds. He had developed a practiced efficiency in his interactions, pleasant but brief, the kind of professional courtesy that didn't invite conversation but didn't discourage it either. When the black sedan pulled in that Friday night, Robert walked out from the office and approached the driver's side window. There were 2 men in the vehicle, both appearing to be in their mid-40s, both wearing dark overcoats despite the mild September's weather. The driver had a square face with prominent cheekbones and dark hair that was graying at the temples. His companion in the passenger seat was slightly younger, heavier built, with a broader face and darker complexion. The driver spoke with a slight accent that Robert couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, perhaps, Russian or Polish or Czech, and he requested $8.50 worth of regular unleaded. What happened next was unusual enough that Robert noticed it, though, at the time, he didn't ascribe any particular significance to the observation. The driver reached into his coat pocket and pulled out not a wallet, but a handful of loose change, quarters and dimes and nickels, which he counted out carefully on the dashboard before handing the exact amount to Robert. The transaction took longer than it should have because the driver was meticulous about the count, double-checking each coin before passing it through the window. Robert took the money, pumped the gas, and returned to the office while the men waited in the vehicle. They didn't speak to each other that he could see. They didn't get out to stretch their legs or use the restroom. When the pump clicked off, the driver started the engine immediately and pulled out of the station without a word, turning north on Route 7 and disappearing into the sparse, late-night traffic. Robert stood at the window of the office and watched the sedan's taillights fade into the distance. Something about the interaction had felt off, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the exact change, the careful counting, the way both men had sat so still in the vehicle, their eyes scanning the station's perimeter as if checking for something or someone. Or perhaps it was simply the late hour and the quiet that made every interaction seem slightly more significant than it actually was. He returned to the register, logged the sale in the handwritten ledger he kept for the overnight shift, and poured himself another cup of coffee. 1 week later, on September 24th at 12:15 a.m., a dark blue sedan pulled into the station, and Robert recognized the two men immediately. The second visit followed the same pattern as the first. The two men arrived after midnight, this time in a different vehicle, a dark blue Chevrolet Impala, instead of the black sedan from the previous week. They ordered $9 in gas and paid with exact change, mostly quarters and dollar bills counted out methodically by the driver before being handed through the window. They remained in the vehicle while Robert pumped the gas, their eyes moving constantly, watching the road, the parking lot, the service bays. When the transaction was complete, they pulled out onto Route 7 and disappeared into the night without a word of thanks or acknowledgement. Robert stood at the pump island after they left and felt the first stirring of genuine curiosity. 2 weeks, 2 different cars. Same two men, same behavior. He went back inside the office and found a small spiral notebook he kept for tracking inventory, flipped to a blank page in the back, and wrote down what he remembered. September the 18th, black sedan, approximately 11:47 p.m., $8.50 in cash, exact change. September 24th, dark blue sedan, approximately 12:15 a.m., $9 in cash, exact change. He added brief descriptions of both men and made a note about the accents he'd detected, the careful counting, the way they never left their vehicle. 2 weeks later, on October 8th, they returned. This time, the vehicle was a brown Ford sedan with Virginia plates, and the pattern repeated itself with such precision that Robert had his notebook ready the moment they pulled away. October 8th, brown sedan, 1:03 a.m., $11.25 in cash, mostly coins and small bills. He added the license plate number this time, writing it quickly before the taillights disappeared around the curve in the road. He also noted that it was a Friday night, and when he checked his previous entries, he realized the other 2 visits had also occurred on Friday nights, or technically early Saturday mornings given the hour. Robert's military background was in signals intelligence, and he'd spent 3 years stationed at Fort Meade analyzing communication patterns for the National Security Agency before his enlistment ended in January 1982. Pattern recognition had been drilled into him during training, the ability to identify anomalies in routine behavior, to spot the signals hidden within the noise of ordinary data. What he was observing now triggered those same analytical instincts. 3 visits over the course of 3 weeks, always late at night, always Friday or Saturday, always different vehicles, always the same 2 men, always paying with exact or near-exact change in small denominations. No credit cards, no large bills, nothing that would create a paper trail or require showing identification. The behavior was intentional. Robert was certain of it. These men were going out of their way to avoid leaving any record of their transactions. They were rotating through different vehicles, which suggested access to multiple cars or some kind of organized motor pool. They were conducting these refueling stops at hours when the station was nearly empty, when there would be minimal witnesses and no crowds. And they were using cash in a way that seemed designed to avoid attention while simultaneously creating the exact opposite effect for anyone who was actually paying attention. By late October, Robert had documented 6 separate visits. October 22nd, gray sedan, 11:52 p.m., $7.75, October 29th, dark green sedan, 12:38 a.m., 10:50. November 5th, black sedan again, but a different model from the first visit, 1:15 a.m., 9:25. Each time, the same meticulous payment ritual. Each time, the same scanning behavior, the same brief transaction, the same immediate departure. Robert began to recognize subtle details he'd missed initially. The driver always kept the engine running while Robert pumped the gas. The passenger always had a map or some kind of document spread across his lap. Both men wore watches, and they checked them frequently, as if operating on a precise schedule. Robert's shift manager was a man named Tom Patterson, a Vietnam veteran in his early 50s who'd been running the overnight operations at the station for nearly a decade. Robert trusted Tom's judgment, and more importantly, he trusted Tom's discretion. On the evening of November 7th, before the start of their shift, Robert showed him the notebook with its growing list of documented visits. Tom read through the entries carefully, his expression neutral, and then looked up at Robert with the kind of measured consideration that came from years of military service. Tom's initial reaction was skeptical. Night shift workers, he pointed out, often preferred cash because it was easier to manage their money when they worked irregular hours. The different vehicles could be explained by car trouble, borrowing from friends, even stolen vehicles if these men were involved in something criminal, but not necessarily related to espionage. The late hours could simply mean they worked night shifts themselves, and this was the most convenient time to stop for gas. But when Robert walked him through the specific pattern, the mathematical precision of it, the way the visits occurred like clockwork every 7 to 10 days, always on weekends, always with the same two men in different cars, Tom's skepticism began to crack. They discussed whether to involve the authorities, and Tom suggested waiting for more evidence. If this was something innocent, calling the FBI would waste everyone's time and potentially cause problems for two men who might simply have unusual but legal reasons for their behavior. But if it was something more serious, they needed documentation solid enough that authorities would take it seriously. Robert agreed and made a decision that would prove critical to the investigation that followed. He would bring his camera to work. Robert brought his Canon AE-1 to work on November 19th, a 35mm camera he'd purchased during his time in the Army and normally used for taking photographs of family gatherings and weekend trips into the mountains. He kept it in the office, positioned on the shelf beneath the register where he could grab it quickly if needed. The camera had a telephoto lens that would allow him to photograph vehicles from inside the building, without having to step outside and risk being noticed by the subjects. On November 28th, at 12:52 a.m., the two men returned in a silver sedan that Robert had not seen before. He watched them pull up to the pump island, waited until the driver was counting out his payment, and then lifted the camera and shot 3 frames through the office window. The photographs captured the vehicle's front license plate, the make and model of the sedan, and a partial view of both men through the windshield. When Robert pumped their gas, his hands were steady and his demeanor unchanged from any other transaction, but his pulse was elevated and he was acutely aware that he'd just documented something that might prove significant. What he noticed during this particular visit was something he'd missed in previous observations. While one man pumped the gas, both remained in the vehicle, which was unusual for the full-service era when most customers got out to stretch their legs or use the restroom, or simply stand near their car while the attendant worked. But more significantly, Robert could see through the passenger side window that the men were studying what appeared to be maps spread across the center console and dashboard. Street maps, the kind sold at gas stations and bookstores, with visible fold lines and notations marked in pen or pencil along certain routes. They were planning something, coordinating movements, and the gas station visit was just one small element in a larger operational sequence. The photographs were developed 3 days later at a 1-hour photo shop in a strip mall 6 miles from the station. Robert paid cash and gave a false name, a precaution he took more out of instinct than any concrete concern about security. When he picked up the prints, he studied them carefully before placing them in an envelope and storing them with his notebook in a locked drawer in his apartment. The license plate was clearly visible in 2 of the 3 shots, and the vehicle's distinctive features, a silver Honda Accord with a small dent in the front bumper, were documented well enough that anyone looking for this specific car would be able to identify it from the photographs. On December 11th, the pattern repeated itself once more, but this time Robert noticed something that elevated his suspicion from mere curiosity to genuine alarm. The vehicle that pulled into the station just after 1 a.m. was a dark sedan with diplomatic plates. The distinctive white-on-blue license plates issued to foreign embassy personnel were immediately recognizable, and Robert felt a cold clarity settle over him as he processed what this meant. The 2 men he'd been documenting for nearly 3 months were not simply criminals or eccentric night workers with unusual payment habits. They were foreign nationals with diplomatic status, which meant they were likely connected to one of the embassies in Washington, and given their behavior, the careful counter-surveillance techniques, the operational security, they were almost certainly intelligence officers. Robert completed the transaction without changing his demeanor, pumped their gas, accepted their payment of $10.75 in quarters and dollar bills, and watched them drive away heading north toward the Capitol Beltway. When their taillights disappeared, he went back inside the office and sat down at the desk, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just observed. He'd been trained at Fort Meade to recognize certain patterns of behavior associated with intelligence operations, and everything about these 2 men fit the profile. The vehicle rotation, the cash payments, the late-night timing, the meticulous attention to avoiding documentation, and now the confirmation of diplomatic status all pointed toward active intelligence work being conducted in the Northern Virginia corridor. The next morning, Robert called Tom Patterson at home and explained what he'd seen. Tom listened without interrupting, and when Robert finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Tom said what Robert had already been thinking. This needed to be reported to the FBI, and it needed to be reported immediately. They were not equipped to investigate this themselves, and if these men were engaged in espionage, every day that passed without law enforcement involvement was another day that classified information might be compromised, or American intelligence officers might be at risk. On December 13, 1982, Robert Haynes called the FBI Washington field office and asked to speak with someone in the counterintelligence division. The meeting took place on December 14th at the FBI's Washington field office in a small conference room on the 3rd floor, where the walls were blank, except for a clock and a photograph of President Reagan. Robert sat across from Special Agent Carol Brennan, a woman in her late 30s with short dark hair and the kind of focused attention that made him feel like every word he spoke was being weighed and cataloged for future reference. She listened as he walked her through the notebook, the documented visits stretching back to September, the pattern of vehicle rotation, the cash payments, the diplomatic plates he'd observed on the most recent visit. When he showed her the photographs, her expression shifted from polite interest to something more immediate and alert. Brennan explained that the FBI had been tracking several suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating in the Washington area. Individuals who held diplomatic positions at the Soviet embassy, but were believed to be conducting espionage activities under the cover of their official duties. The challenge, she said, was that these officers were highly trained in counter-surveillance techniques and had become increasingly difficult to monitor using traditional methods. They avoided known FBI observation points, varied their routes constantly, and conducted their activities in ways that made it nearly impossible to establish patterns that could be used to predict their movements or identify their contacts. What Robert had documented, she told him, was exactly the kind of operational pattern the FBI had been trying to find for months. The Counterintelligence Division maintained files on dozens of Soviet diplomats suspected of intelligence work, and Brennan pulled several folders from a locked cabinet and spread photographs across the conference table. Robert studied the faces carefully, moving through image after image of men who all looked vaguely similar in the way that official identification photographs always looked similar, formal poses, and neutral expressions that revealed nothing about personality or intent. On the seventh photograph, he stopped. The face was older than he remembered, the lighting different, but the prominent cheekbones and the way the hairline receded at the temples were unmistakable. This was the driver, the man who always counted out exact change before handing it through the window. His name was Alexei Volkov, and according to the file Brennan opened, he was listed as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, a position that gave him diplomatic immunity and allowed him to move freely throughout the Washington area without the restrictions placed on lower-level embassy staff. But the FBI's assessment, detailed in reports dating back to his arrival in the United States in March 1980, was that Volkov was a KGB officer working under diplomatic cover, specifically assigned to Line PR, which handled political intelligence gathering. He had previously been stationed at the Soviet embassy in London from 1976 to 1979, where British intelligence had identified him as being involved in espionage activities, and he'd been quietly expelled from the United Kingdom in early 1980 before being reassigned to Washington. The second man took longer to identify, but when Robert pointed to a photograph near the bottom of the stack, Brennan nodded with what looked like satisfaction. Viktor Marchenko, age 38, listed as an administrative officer at the Soviet embassy, suspected to be a support agent who handled logistics and coordination for active intelligence operations. Marchenko had less extensive documentation in the FBI files because he kept an even lower profile than Volkov, rarely appearing at diplomatic functions and maintaining minimal contact with the known intelligence operatives. But his name had come up in debriefings from a Soviet defector who'd provided information to the CIA in 1981, identifying Marchenko as someone who facilitated dead drops and serviced communication sites for KGB officers operating in the United States. Brennan asked Robert if he'd be willing to cooperate with an FBI surveillance operation, and when he agreed, she explained what that cooperation would entail. Robert would continue working his normal shifts at the gas station, conducting business exactly as he always had, showing no indication that he'd noticed anything unusual about Volkov and Marchenko or their payment patterns. When the two men appeared again, Robert would signal the FBI by turning on a specific exterior light mounted above the service bay doors, a light that was normally kept off during overnight hours. FBI agents would be positioned in unmarked vehicles within visual range of the station, and when they received Robert's signal, they would begin mobile surveillance following Volkov and Marchenko after they left the station to determine where they went and what activities they engaged in after refueling their vehicle. The operation was authorized to begin on December 20th, and FBI technicians installed a small camera in the gas station office, positioned behind the cash register with a view through the front window that captured the pump islands and the parking area. The camera was connected to a recording system hidden in a locked cabinet beneath the counter, and Robert was instructed to activate it whenever Volkov and Marchenko appeared. The recordings would provide additional documentation of the encounters and might capture details that Robert missed during the actual transactions. For the next week, nothing happened. Christmas approached, and the overnight shifts at the station became quieter as people stayed home with their families, and traffic along Route 7 thinned to occasional cars and long-haul trucks passing through on their way to destinations farther south. Robert worked his shifts with heightened awareness, watching every vehicle that pulled into the station, checking license plates, studying faces. But Volkov and Marchenko did not appear, and by December 27th, Robert began to wonder if the operation had been compromised somehow, if the two men had detected his interest or decided for unrelated reasons to change their refueling location. Then, on January 2nd, 1983, just after midnight, a black sedan pulled into the station, and Robert recognized both men immediately. Robert activated the hidden camera and turned on the exterior light above the service bay doors, the signal that would alert FBI surveillance teams positioned in the parking lot of a closed shopping center 300 yards south of the station. Volkov and Marchenko ordered $12 in gas, and the driver counted out the payment in quarters and dollar bills with the same meticulous precision Robert had observed in every previous encounter. He pumped their gas while they remained in the vehicle, completed the transaction, and watched them pull out onto Route 7, heading north toward the Capitol Beltway. Within seconds, two unmarked FBI vehicles pulled out from their surveillance positions and began following at a distance, carefully calculated to avoid detection while maintaining visual contact. The surveillance teams tracked the sedan as it proceeded north for approximately 6 miles, before merging onto the George Washington Parkway, a route that ran along the Potomac River and connected Northern Virginia to Washington, D.C. The vehicles maintained separation using a rotating follow pattern, where different cars would take the lead position every few minutes, a technique designed to prevent the subjects from identifying a single vehicle that appeared to be trailing them consistently. At 1:47 a.m., the sedan exited the parkway and turned into a residential area in McLean, a suburb known for its expensive homes and its proximity to CIA headquarters in Langley. The FBI vehicles dropped back as the sedan entered a neighborhood where unfamiliar cars would be immediately noticeable to residents, and potentially to the subjects themselves if they were conducting counter-surveillance checks. The sedan pulled into the parking lot of a garden-style apartment complex called Wintergreen Terrace and parked in a space near Building C. Volkov and Marchenko exited the vehicle and walked to a ground-floor apartment, unlocking the door and entering without looking back toward the street. FBI agents noted the apartment number, photographed the building and the vehicle from a distance, and then withdrew to avoid compromising the surveillance. When they ran the apartment complex through their databases, they discovered that Wintergreen Terrace housed several diplomatic personnel from various embassies, including 3 families connected to the Soviet embassy, and 2 individuals who worked at the Cuban mission to the United Nations. Over the following 6 weeks, the FBI conducted intensive background investigation into both Volkov and Marchenko, while simultaneously expanding surveillance to monitor their daily activities beyond the gas station visits. Phone taps were authorized under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, allowing agents to monitor calls made from their apartments and from embassy phone lines they were known to use. Physical surveillance teams followed both men during their movements around the Washington area, documenting their routes, their stops, and any individuals they met or locations they visited that seemed inconsistent with their stated diplomatic duties. What emerged from this surveillance was a pattern of behavior that confirmed the FBI's suspicions about active intelligence operations. Volkov maintained a regular schedule of meetings at the Soviet embassy and occasional attendance at diplomatic functions, but approximately twice each week he would leave the embassy during afternoon hours and drive circuitous routes through Northern Virginia, making multiple turns, doubling back on his path, and stopping at random locations in ways that indicated he was checking for surveillance before proceeding to his actual destination. Marchenko was even more mobile, frequently driving to various locations throughout the D.C. metropolitan area, coffee shops and libraries and public parks, where he would sit for brief periods before moving on to the next location. On February 17th, FBI surveillance teams observed behavior that provided the breakthrough the investigation needed. After visiting the gas station the previous night and refueling with their characteristic cash payment, Marchenko had driven to Bluemont Park in Arlington, a small recreational area with walking trails and scattered park benches overlooking a wooded ravine. He parked in the lot at 2:35 p.m., walked to a specific bench positioned near the trailhead, and sat down for approximately 3 minutes. When he stood up and walked back to his vehicle, surveillance agents noticed that he'd left something behind, a small package wrapped in brown paper that he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket when he arrived. The package remained on the bench, partially concealed beneath the wooden slats, for approximately 18 minutes before another man approached. The second man was dressed in jogging clothes and appeared to be out for an afternoon run, but his route took him directly to the bench where Marchenko had been sitting. He sat down briefly, ostensibly to rest, and when he stood up moments later, the package was gone. FBI agents photographed the man and followed him as he jogged back to the parking lot and got into a Toyota sedan. When they ran the license plate, they identified the registered owner as Thomas Wheeler, a 45-year-old analyst at the Department of Energy with security clearance that gave him access to classified information related to nuclear energy research and strategic resource assessments. The FBI opened a parallel investigation into Wheeler, conducting financial background checks and surveillance of his movements. What they discovered was that Wheeler had no obvious financial problems or lifestyle inconsistencies that would immediately suggest espionage, but his access to sensitive information made him a potentially valuable asset for Soviet intelligence. Further surveillance revealed that Wheeler made similar visits to different locations throughout Northern Virginia, always leaving small packages in public places that were later retrieved by individuals the FBI was able to identify and track. By early March 1983, the FBI had mapped what appeared to be an extensive network. Volkov and Marchenko were running at least 4 separate assets, individuals with access to classified information, who were being paid to photograph documents and pass them through dead drops serviced by the 2 Soviet intelligence officers. The gas station visits, the FBI concluded, were operational preparation. Volkov and Marchenko were refueling embassy vehicles before conducting their intelligence runs, and the cash payments were part of their broader pattern of avoiding any transactions that would create records linking them to specific locations at specific times. The decision was made to move forward with arrests, and the timing would be critical. The FBI needed to catch the subjects during an active intelligence operation, ideally at the moment when materials were being exchanged, in order to build the strongest possible case for espionage charges that would withstand scrutiny in federal court. On March 23, 1983, at 12:47 a.m., Volkov and Marchenko pulled into the Exxon station in a dark sedan that Robert had not seen in their previous visits. He activated the hidden camera, turned on the exterior service bay light, and walked out to take their order. They requested $12.75 in gas, and Volkov counted out the payment in quarters and dollar bills, with the same deliberate precision Robert had witnessed more than a dozen times over the past 6 months. The transaction proceeded exactly as it always had, unremarkable in every detail except for the knowledge that FBI surveillance teams were watching from multiple positions, and that what happened in the next few hours would determine whether months of investigation would result in arrests or simply more observation and waiting. The FBI followed the sedan as it departed the station and headed north on Route 7, before eventually making its way into Tyson's Corner, an area of Northern Virginia that was rapidly developing from farmland into commercial centers and residential subdivisions. At 3:17 a.m., the sedan stopped at a 24-hour diner, and both men went inside for approximately 20 minutes. Surveillance agents positioned in the parking lot maintained visual contact through the diner's windows and observed Volkov and Marchenko sitting in a booth, drinking coffee, and reviewing what appeared to be maps or documents spread on the table between them. When they emerged and returned to their vehicle, they drove west into Vienna, a quiet suburb where most residents were asleep and the streets were empty except for the occasional car passing through on late-night errands. The sedan stopped in a residential neighborhood near a cluster of community mailboxes that served several nearby apartment complexes. Marchenko exited the vehicle carrying what appeared to be a standard business envelope, walked directly to the mailbox cluster, and placed the envelope into a specific slot marked with an apartment number. He returned to the vehicle and Volkov drove away immediately, turning back toward the main roads that would take them to the Capital Beltway and eventually back to their apartment in McLean. FBI agents waited exactly 3 minutes after the sedan departed, then moved in to secure the mailbox location. The envelope Marchenko had deposited was retrieved using a warrant that had been prepared in advance, and when agents opened it, they found $500 in cash divided into 5 $100 bills, a single sheet of paper with coded instructions written in Russian, and a small film canister containing microfilm with images of classified documents. The arrest teams moved in at 4:23 a.m., intercepting the sedan approximately 2 miles from the mailbox location as Volkov and Marchenko drove along a stretch of road with minimal traffic and no nearby residences where a confrontation might draw attention. Multiple FBI vehicles boxed in the sedan from front and rear, and agents with weapons drawn ordered both men out of the vehicle. Volkov and Marchenko complied without resistance, and they were handcuffed and placed in separate FBI vehicles for transport to the Washington field office. A search of their sedan revealed camera equipment concealed in the trunk, $2,400 in cash stored in a briefcase under the front seat, and several pages of handwritten notes containing what appeared to be coded communications and operational instructions. Simultaneously, FBI agents executed arrest warrants at 3 separate locations, taking into custody Thomas Wheeler at his home in Arlington, a State Department clerk named Patricia Donnelly at her apartment in Alexandria, and a defense contractor named Raymond Cross at his residence in Falls Church. All 3 were charged with espionage-related offenses based on evidence gathered during the months-long surveillance operation, and all 3 would eventually provide detailed confessions in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Wheeler admitted to photographing classified documents related to nuclear energy research beginning in 1980, after being recruited by Volkov during a chance meeting at a Washington bookstore. Donnelly confessed to copying diplomatic cables and internal State Department memoranda starting in 1981, motivated by financial difficulties and ideological disillusionment with Reagan administration policies. Cross acknowledged stealing technical specifications for military communications equipment since 1979, before Volkov and Marchenko had even arrived in the United States, suggesting he'd been an established asset who was simply transferred to new handlers when his original Soviet contact departed. Volkov and Marchenko immediately claimed diplomatic immunity and refused to answer questions during FBI interrogations. The State Department engaged in tense negotiations with the Soviet embassy over the following week, and on March 30th, both men were declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. They boarded an Aeroflot flight to Moscow that afternoon, and the Soviet embassy issued a formal protest, claiming the entire investigation had been a provocation designed to harass legitimate diplomatic personnel. The 3 American assets were prosecuted in federal court, and their trials, held separately between May and August of 1983, resulted in prison sentences ranging from 12 to 18 years. A 4th asset, mentioned by Wheeler during his debriefing but never definitively identified, remained at large and was presumed to have either fled the country or ceased intelligence activities after the arrests. Robert Haynes received a $10,000 reward from the FBI for information leading to the arrests. Money he used as a down payment on a small house in Springfield, not far from the gas station where the investigation had begun. He was sworn to secrecy about his role in the operation, and the case remained classified until partial declassification in 2003 allowed certain details to be released to the public. Robert left the gas station in 1985 and used his GI Bill benefits to attend college, eventually earning a degree in criminal justice and joining the FBI as an intelligence analyst in 1988. He worked in the counterintelligence division through the end of the Cold War and into the post-Soviet era, retiring in 2008 after 20 years of service. The Exxon station on Route 7 continued operating until 1997, when it was demolished to make way for highway expansion, and the intersection where it once stood is now part of a wider road configuration that bears no trace of the building, where a night shift attendant noticed something unusual and decided it was worth investigating. Robert occasionally drives past the location and thinks about how a simple observation about cash payments led to the dismantling of a Soviet spy network that had been operating undetected for years. In the end, what made the difference was not sophisticated surveillance technology or dramatic confrontations, but simply paying attention when nobody else was, and understanding that sometimes the smallest details reveal the largest secrets.